You are watching a special edition of India Global. I'm Parmeshwar Bawa. As 2023 draws to a close, in this episode, we reflect on a year marked by escalating tensions and enduring conflicts, casting long shadows across the globe. From the persistent strife in Ukraine to the ongoing war in Gaza and the volatile situation in the South China Sea, the world has witnessed a surge in geopolitical unrest. This year was also defined by the growing tensions between China and the US, despite efforts to quell those tensions throughout 2023, while Justin Trudeau's unsubstantiated allegation against India over Hardeep Singh Nijjar's killing created a mess of our bilateral relations. From Turkey to Nepal, we witnessed deadly earthquakes. A petro-state, Dubai, hosted the annual COP28 climate summit, which resulted in a deal that some have described as historic and others merely incremental. Meanwhile, as we conclude this year, Europe is grappling with an escalating migrant crisis, while the United States faces internal political challenges with global repercussions. It was a riveting year for Indian space exploration when Chandrayaan-3 successfully touched down on the lunar surface, making India the fourth nation to successfully land on the moon and the first to land in the South Pole region. India also surpassed China as the world's most populous nation. This year, many argue, marked the final nail in the coffin for what had remained of the global order. But as things stand at this very moment, the widespread fear in the West that the ongoing Israel-Hamas war would spark a full-fledged regional war between the US-Israel and half a dozen Arab-Iranian forces has not materialized. However, neither has this confrontation remained confined to Gaza. It has sparked the first serious coordinated battlefield action by the Axis of Resistance across the region. It is undeniable that a broadened conflict could have painful economic consequences, given the Red Sea's critical importance to global supply chain routes for energy as well as goods. But this, as Gaza health officials say, more than 20,000 people have been killed in this ongoing war.
How hundreds of terrorists could have entered what is believed to be the most heavily fortified nation on earth is a debate which will stretch on for years. What happened though on the 7th of October goes down as among the deadliest terrorist attacks in history. At 6:30 a.m. that day, air raid sirens coincided with the heaviest barrage of Hamas rockets from the Gaza Strip onto Israel. Within 30 minutes, the Supernova Music Festival near the Re'em kibbutz was attacked by terrorists, some of whom arrived by paragliders. In the bloodbath that followed, 260 of the 3,000 to 5,000 who were present at the festival were killed, many others abducted. By 7:40 a.m. it was clear Israel was under an unprecedented attack by land, air and sea. Hamas terrorists infiltrated frontline townships. They went house to house, murdering anyone they could find, including children.
My sister flagged, mentioned in our group chat that my grandma posted something on her Facebook, a video of my grandmother lying on her kitchen floor, living room floor, with blood surrounding her hands clenched on her chest, and men with guns.
1,400 had been killed in the initial attack on Israel. Over 200 had been kidnapped. It did not take long for Tel Aviv to react.
אנחנו במלחמה ואנחנו ננצח בה.
Gaza was cut off and the bombing began, unrelenting. The destruction of deemed military targets in a heavily populated area where a large number of victims were innocent civilians. The elderly, women, children, babies, people who had nothing to do with Hamas and its cult of terror. On the ground, Israeli ground forces waited for what was clearly inevitable, a full-fledged ground assault.
This humming is the humming of war. Now it's tanks, it's army, and this is a situation which might escalate any moment.
Israel's ground assault, when it did come, came with instructions to millions who lived in the north of the Gaza Strip: move south or remain at your own peril. The goal of Israeli forces was clear: locate underground tunnels used by Hamas while going from door to door in search of terrorists, all while the bombing of targets from the air continued. Hospitals, Israel insists, have been centers for Hamas to operate from. In Gaza, the humanitarian crisis continued to grow. Hospitals running out of supplies, food scarce, water supplies erratic, even body bags running out as the number of those killed continued to grow. Authorities in Gaza say that as many as 20,000 Palestinians, the large majority of them women and children, have been killed, numbers that Israel disputes. Finally, amidst the unrelenting violence, hope. A hostage swap as part of a deal being worked out with negotiators from Qatar, Egypt and the US. On the 21st of November, Israel's government approved a deal with Hamas to exchange 150 Palestinian prisoners for 50 hostages being held in Gaza. This was accompanied by a 4-day ceasefire during which aid lorries were finally allowed into the strip through the Rafah border crossing. But the war is hardly ended, with renewed attacks occurring constantly. Amidst talks of another swap of Palestinian prisoners for the remaining Israeli hostages still being held. Until that happens, the war continues. Multiple clashes between Palestinian and Israeli forces, the destruction of buildings in the densely packed Gaza Strip. And as the new year approaches, an altogether new dimension to the war. Houthi rebels operating in Yemen, more than 2,000 kilometers away, have started targeting civilian ships affiliated with Israel in any way. With the Red Sea, a lifeline of international commerce, becoming increasingly unsafe, with dozens of ships being targeted with missiles and drones. Vishnu Shom for NDTV.
Meanwhile, India's G20 presidency came at a crisis-ridden time and allowed India to be at the helm of a troubled global order and advocate for New Delhi's brand of multilateralism. Here's a recap of all the G20 action for you.
G20 में भी हमारा मंत्र है वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर.
The 2023 meeting of world leaders from the group of 20 nations. A moment of unity in a deeply fractured international space. India's moment to bring together disparate voices and ideologies and forge consensus on some of the most divisive issues facing the world. This was not any government event. It was mission-driven, with an all-of-India approach, the highest profile international gathering in the history of independent India. With over 200 meetings in 60 Indian cities in all 28 states and 8 union territories, India's G20 brought together multiple working tracks and engagement groups at an unprecedented size, scale and scope.
When we took up the presidency, which was almost exactly a year ago, honestly, people didn't have too much expectations of it. Now, what we were able to do in our G20, in terms of diplomacy, was actually to bridge all these divides, to find a common ground for countries who were otherwise arguing among themselves, who found their positions very difficult to reconcile. But we were able to bridge it.
While China's Xi chose not to attend and Russian President Vladimir Putin couldn't because of charges he faced linked to the war in Ukraine, all other key international leaders were in Delhi. And the end result defied expectations.
मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं.
A unanimous adoption of the G20 New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. All 83 paragraphs were passed unanimously. There was no footnote or chair summary, with India's negotiators wading into the vexed issue of the Russia-Ukraine war to find language that worked for everyone. Negotiations went down to the wire.
Close to 200 hours of non-stop negotiations. And, the Bali para had broken down. We were struggling with it for 9 months. So in the Sofa Talk meeting, we just took a plain screen and I scribbled down about 15 principles which we should follow. And then all the Sherpas joined in and gave their perspective on it, and all of them we took.
Among the big takeaways, to accelerate the full and effective implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Tripling renewable energy capacity globally by 2030. Improving access to digital public infrastructure. The inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member of the G20. And promoting the effective participation of women in the global economy. The end results were widely appreciated. In a post on X, the US President Joe Biden wrote, "At a moment when the global economy is suffering from the overlapping shocks of the climate crisis, fragility and conflict, this year's summit proved that the G20 can still drive solutions to our most pressing issues."
Please allow me to thank Prime Minister Modi. Faithful to its principles, India did its utmost for its presidency of the G20 to serve unity and peace.
मैं ब्राजील के राष्ट्रपति और मेरे मित्र लूला डी सिल्वा को हार्दिक शुभकामनाएं देता हूं और मैं उनको प्रेसिडेंसी का गेवल सौंपता हूं.
India has now handed over the G20 presidency to Brazil, bringing an end to what Delhi says has been an action-oriented, decisive, inclusive and ambitious G20 declaration, one that sets out a path to tackle global challenges. For India, G20 2023 has been a historic milestone in New Delhi's journey to assume greater prominence among the world's major powers. Vishnu Shom for NDTV.
Well, switching tracks, Xi Jinping secured an unprecedented third term as China's president, further solidifying his position as the nation's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong. Though China-US relations remain tense, Xi Jinping's meeting with his American counterpart Joe Biden was marked by candid discussions, with both leaders agreeing to resume military-to-military communications. This triggered protests from not just India but also several Southeast Asian countries. Now, in addition, India is also closely watching China's ties with Bhutan after their border talks in Beijing. Meanwhile, on Xi's home ground, challenges on the economic front appear far more daunting.
From the worst earthquake in decades to economic woes to mystery diseases, 2023 may perhaps be China's annus horribilis. But that didn't deter Xi's expansionist tendencies. From retaining China's stranglehold on Taiwan to expanding global influence to counter the US. The natural disaster was not the only blow for China in 2023. Hopes of a recovery after the COVID shutdown were dashed. 2023 saw the Chinese economy stalling to a point where it's being called a drag on world output by the International Monetary Fund, among others. From a collapsing real estate sector, local government debt, downward spiral of exports to weak spending and staggeringly high unemployment. So much so that reports say the Chinese government has stopped publishing the data. China's trade tussle with the US has resulted in an exodus of manufacturing from China to friendlier shores like India. A study by the Boston Consulting Group has found that India may be the biggest winner as US companies continue to shift away from Chinese manufacturing.
I think in July, the Chinese leadership realized that the economy was in deeper trouble, was in more serious trouble than the leadership expected. So they started to pump more money into the economy.
Chinese President Xi Jinping also garnered unwanted attention as some of his top officials, such as former Defense Minister Li Shangfu and ex-Foreign Minister Qin Gang, went missing. Xi continues to assert China's hold on Taiwan, adding to tensions. Earlier this week, he said that the reunification of Taiwan with China is inevitable, reiterating Beijing's long-held stand on the self-ruled island democracy ahead of a crucial election next month. China's reopening brought a parade of foreign leaders to Beijing as it strengthened links with the Mideast and other developing regions and showed support for Russia and set about mending relations with Europe, the US and Australia. Saudi Arabia and Iran reached an agreement in Beijing to re-establish diplomatic relations. India is closely watching China's ties with Bhutan after border talks in Beijing. But ongoing border talks between Bhutan and China to formally demarcate their boundary have not prevented Beijing from continuing unsanctioned construction activity in North Bhutan's Jakarlung Valley.
Startling high-resolution satellite images that we'll now share with you indicate that ongoing border talks between Bhutan and China to formally demarcate their boundary have not prevented Beijing from continuing unsanctioned construction activity in North Bhutan's Jakarlung Valley. The extent of the Chinese construction in this also suggests that Thimphu may have no option but to accept the fait accompli presented by the Chinese in this area, which incidentally lies just 50 kilometers from Bhutan's eastern border with Arunachal Pradesh. Now, the satellite image that you see here covers the expanse of Chinese construction activity in one part of the Jakarlung Valley to Bhutan's north. You just saw one Chinese-built enclave. You can now see the road network, and finally, in a few seconds, what you will see is a second Chinese enclave in this area. So where is this area? On this map, we can show you 4 areas where China has illegally entered Bhutan and constructed villages and military outposts. Let's zoom into the Jakarlung area that we are focusing on. The yellow area is what we will be closely looking at. You can also see the Chinese road network clearly marked here. The image that you now see is from August 2021. The Chinese had entered this area, but take a look at this. This is the very same area, entirely built up. There are more than 100 residential homes here. This image just 4 days old.
The silver lining for China probably is a surprising successful meeting between Xi and US President Joe Biden in November. The summit led to a key agreement restoring military-to-military communications. But the US also broadened its export controls on advanced computer chips just before the meet. And a collision of Chinese and Philippine ships in the South China Sea hearkened to tensions that could draw the US into conflict.
将来中国现在有了更多的物质储备，如果提供一些援助，加强一些合作，加上过去又有积累，那似乎是中国参与大国博弈，参与全球治理的一个现实的一个解决方案。
Chinese President Xi Jinping is putting a turbulent year behind China and is entering 2024, the year of the dragon according to the Chinese calendar, hoping for better times ahead, but by the looks of it, he will end up living even more dangerously. With Vishal Vivek, Bureau Report, NDTV.
In India, 2023 will also be remembered as the year we went to the moon. Chandrayaan-3 touched down in the lunar South Pole region, an area on the moon's surface that no one had reached before. This year was a momentous one to report on. So much has happened this year, you'll be forgiven for thinking the world packed up 2 years in one. We'll be tracking the latest developments from across the country and around the world for you going into 2024. Thank you so much for investing your time and watching. We leave you with this.
The final descent onto the surface of the moon. Several minutes of hell for scientists at ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization. This is what they had worked at for years. But right now, as they watch this live feed of the Vikram lander make its way down to the surface of the moon, they could do nothing. Vikram was on full automatic mode. It was making decisions for itself. And then, finally, touchdown.
Lander module are applauding. Let us all wait to hear from the Secretary Department.
The entire nation loves us, ISRO, for the accomplishment, and with the support of the nation only we can progress. And I am very grateful for all your love and affection and your prayers for making us succeed. I think it says so much about belief in our own system and our own people, and that is something that we need to celebrate.
India was now the fourth nation in the world to have landed a spacecraft with a rover on the surface of the moon, and the first nation to have managed to touch down close to the moon's south pole. This was the bittersweet moment for India. Just a few years earlier, Chandrayaan-2 crashed onto the surface of the moon just moments before it was to touch down. But the spirit of ISRO runs deep. Chandrayaan-3 was an incredible story.
Plus 5 seconds. Lift-off normal. P1 tracking. R2 tracking.
Hours after settling onto the lunar surface, Vikram, the lander, opened up a ramp for Pragyan, a small rover, to move to the surface of the moon.
Tell us a little bit about the Pragyan rover. The fact that it was able to semi-autonomously avoid areas that you wanted it to avoid. There was also a lot of data it generated. What is some of the science that you got out of Pragyan and Vikram?
So the rover, as you told, it is a semi-autonomous way of operation, because a rover is not directly communicating with Earth. It is always communicating via lander, because it is very tiny, which has which is 26 kg of mass with small size, but it is inbuilt with all the functions. We have two scientific instruments. One is alpha particle X-ray spectrometer. The next instrument is laser-based induced spectroscopy. These both instruments will measure the major and minor rock-forming elements, like various elements like calcium, iron, titanium, and it has detected various elements also like sulfur and all. The other one is basically operates in the laser wavelength, 1550 nanometer wavelength, which is again a spectroscopic kind of an experiment that also measures the various rock-forming elements. This will confirm the actual surface experiments.
The Chandrayaan mission was an engineering triumph, but there was a larger scientific component as well. Both Vikram and the Pragyan rover had specific instruments on board to enable them to carry out chemical analysis of the surface of the moon. The mission as a whole is also a huge first step as India's space program gets set for its next big challenge, an Indian space station in the 2030s and the first Indian on the surface of the moon in the 2040s. 2023 was another year when ISRO sparked the interest of a nation on indigenous engineering, Indian science, and our quest to make a mark on the ultimate frontier, space. Vishnu Shobh for NDTV.